that was pretty good. Okay, good. I'm glad you had a more efficient
That's a very clever
method.
Yeah, I didn't know about that.
I knew everything up until you could dumping it into text and searching, which was
yeah.
Wow.
it's one of those Sherlock Holmes kind of like, well, obviously you should do that. And you're like, well, how come nobody does it but Sherlock Holmes?
Right. I found that out after one of these days where it's like, I know that this is somewhere in this 2-hour debate, but I can't find a spot where he's talking about this thing.
Yeah, I agree that it's probably horrendous suffering kind of thing. So I'm trying to figure out how to run the short version of, so appeal to the class. What's a really good way of giving the whole, when somebody says God is, either doesn't exist or is culpable in some way for creating a world where we've got evil and suffering in it. So if he's all powerful and all good, then he wouldn't want any suffering in here. And the exercise that as we did it in this class was something that I don't think you can replicate in 5 minutes, probably, but in 5 minutes.
Okay.
Which is, okay, you think you can do a better job than God. What's the way to build the best world? And we walked through it over at least a class, maybe a couple of them, where we said, okay, well, what should the facets of a perfect world be? And we got to, okay, love should be the principal characteristic of that world. What do you need in order to have love? Well, love, in order to have that, you have to have free thinking creatures with the capability for freely choosing to love the other person. Otherwise, they're robots. Otherwise, it's a love potion. Otherwise, it doesn't count as true love. And so you need bidirectional free will of equal power of the will. And then there's another equal power, which is, it can't be a shotgun wedding where you're like, you want to marry me? And because the person might make their choice based on other considerations rather than their free choice to love you kind of thing. And so on the, to me, that logical pathway is extremely important to establish in such a way that the person is bought in, not just saying like, I think that's plausibly the case, but rather it has to be that way. Like there's no way to do this other than that. You have to have these things. And if you have those things, then you end up with a world where you have to have at least the potential for conflict. And then to me, the answer is, well, why not just pick the people who are going to do that? Is the whole, like, there's 4 kinds of people, the good, the bad, the contingently good, the contingently bad. And you want you can have all 3 of these groups if you build the world the right way. So the all good, you can have them anytime, any world you put them in. The contingently good can only be in a good world. The contingently bad can only be in the good world. The contingently good need a world with evil in them in order to get them. So you have to have all of these people, right? If you want these people, you have to have a world like this. And if the argument of God wants all of these instead of just some of them, how do you say that in 5 minutes in a way where people are like, yeah, obviously it has to be that way. Because I think that by the time that you discuss it yourself and whoever's facilitating is like, how else would you do it? Is there another way to do it? And you talk through all the possibilities, you come to the conclusion of there really isn't a way to build the perfect world and get all the possible people in it without building a filtering phase and an exclusion event and then an inclusion phase. So if that's the answer, I think, to the problem of horrendous suffering. But you got 5 minutes to do it, and boys, how are we going to do this?
And you need to, I know we've done this, you need to throw in the evil, that you have to have the choice for bad. Because if you hadn't put the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in there, it would be limiting our choices, I guess, by necessity, that our choices are limited in many ways. But if there's not even the option to do evil, again, it's sort of a robotic and controlled.
Yeah, I see the tree of knowledge of good and evil as not Adam and Eve looking at it and being like, okay, well, I know some stuff, but knowing the difference between good and evil. Because that's what it actually said was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's basically knowing what is good and what is evil. Right. That's weird if you think about it. So Adam and Eve don't know they're like, what is this good and evil of which you speak? Like, they don't even know what evil is. So that's how a world is good when it's not even a category that you hold. That you're like, oh, okay, well.
Well, in some ways, I think of it as a dog, that you have to teach it what's wrong. The dog does whatever and doesn't feel guilty. I mean, guilt comes in from the master training the dog. The dog doesn't feel guilty for the things it does.
So I don't object in one sense to that one, but
Yeah,
the problem that I have with that is only, I think, in my opinion, to my thinking, you can only be a moral agent if you can think about thinking. Because in order to think about thinking, you need to be able to put yourself in the mind of the other person.
Okay, yeah.
I don't know that dogs put themselves in the mind of other dogs. That
Right,
kind of
I don't want to get too far in there.
So, but to your point, half of your point I think is exactly right. The other half, you just have to add the human level thinking on top of it.
Right.
I was thinking about this, and instead of trying to go through the entire thing where you try to list out, like always good, sometimes good, that kind of thing, maybe if we just simplified it and said, there could be a group of people that will choose heaven only if they see the effects of evil. And so it's advantageous to build a world. If you want all possible people, it's advantageous to build a world that includes those individuals. And just kind of leave it at that.
Yeah, the way I wanted to do, the reason I wanted to get to, sorry, yeah, go ahead.
It's a strange argument.
Sorry, I'm saying if you have, I've heard the whole thing and I understand it, but I think if you just said that, it would sound very obvious that you didn't understand.
Right, the whole reason to get there.
Yeah.
Like the contingently good, the contingently bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the way that I had tried to figure out how do I do that in 60 seconds was something like, hey, look, we know there are people, or it seems like there are people who always choose to do the wrong thing. Like no matter what you give them, they're just going to choose to do the wrong thing. You probably know somebody like this in your life, but if not,
Morally wrong.
Yeah, morally wrong. Then maybe there are people who would always do the good thing. I don't know any of those people, but maybe such a thing exists. Christians at least think some angels are like that. They're always choosing the right thing. But there are people who, so imagine, tell me if you had a brother or sister that was like this. Your parent used the stove thing. Your parents say, now listen, kids, whatever you do, don't touch this stove, it's hot. And your brother is the kind of guy who's like, as soon as you tell him not to do something, he's like, I wonder how many different ways I can do the thing that they just told me not to do. So your brother reaches up and he touches the stove. And he burns his hand and he's like, ah! And you watch it and you're like, ooh, okay, that was a bad idea. Both of you conclude eventually something like this. I should have listened to mom or dad, because they weren't just saying it to be jerks and make up a rule. They literally didn't want me to get hurt. One person had to do it, and the other person had to at least see it. You had to see your brother do it, and you're like, I'm not touching the stove, I'm listening to the old man or old lady from now on. And the brother was like, okay, maybe I should start listening. So those people we call contingently good. And those are almost everybody in this world could be contingently good, or half the people in this world could be contingently good. The other contingently evil are the kinds of people that you can imagine they're just always good unless you told them about something evil or showed them something evil. Like it would never occur to them. Maybe none of those people are in this world or they get corrupted so quickly, but at least it's a possibility. So you have always good, always bad, contingently good, contingently bad. And we know at least one of these categories because we are that person. And then I would say, okay, if God can see all of these are all his children, and he can always get all of these, and he can never get these, he then can make the contingently evil ones, he can get those easily by only putting them in heaven. So that means he's missing 25% naively of his children, 1 in 4. So in order to get these, he has to build a world where they see the results and effects of evil. Some of them need to see a little bit of evil to be like, yep, nope, I'm not doing that. And some of them, like possibly your brother, who not only has to burn his hand, he's got to bump his head and get a cut and probably break his arm and all that before he eventually is like, maybe I should listen. Or like the people who end up at the rock bottom in jail, and they're like, you know what, I need to turn my life around, and then they turn their life around. So there's a range of good and evil that you need to see. But God is interested, like an all good God isn't just mildly interested in this. An all good, all loving God must have all of them, which means he must build a world where you get these people right here. So some more eloquent version of that is what I was trying to figure out how to do with a slide or a couple of slides and 60 seconds or 120 seconds worth of talking.
I think you're being too generous to the evil people because, putting your hand on the stove, that's just exploring your environment. That's pushing the boundaries. It's not listening to mom and dad. But saying to your brother, did mom and dad really say don't put your hand on this?
Yeah, but that guy's probably in this category.
Oh, yeah, oh, definitely.
Yeah, right.
oh, yeah, right. But that's what I mean. the other guy who just puts his hand on the stove, that's not necessarily evil, that's just exploring it. But when he says to his brother, go ahead and touch it, gets him to put his hand on the stove, that's the evil.
So this is not the best story to tell it, but I think it's really clever. I may have said it in here before. If I have, forgive me. I haven't seen this. Somebody told me about this. This was a Twilight Zone episode of a guy who's like clearly kind of a bad dude. I think he gets hit by a bus or something like that, and he shows up to the pearly gates, and the guy at the pearly gates is like, yeah, come on in, and he gives him this mansion, and it's amazing, and he has this beautiful wife and all perfect idyllic neighborhood, but he's a little bit of a bad guy, so he's living in there for a little while, and then like everybody's so nice, but he just wants to be a little bit bad, and he like ends up hitting his wife, and she just laughs at him because it doesn't hurt her. And he like hits her harder, and she just laughs harder because it doesn't hurt her. Like he gets all grumpy about this, and I think he tries to go up and like beat somebody up, and they just laugh because it's funny, and he's starting to get all grumpy, and eventually after some period of time he goes back to the pearly gates, and he's like, hey, look, I'm not sure I'm in the right place, right? This place isn't making me happy. Maybe I need to go to the other place. Maybe I shouldn't be here in heaven. And the guy says, who told you this was heaven?
Right.
And so like I think that there are people who have to, like that was a bad guy, right? I think there are people who hurt people and then realize they don't like it. Some kids immediately. I don't know if you've ever seen a kid who like sees the cartoon or whatever, he punches his brother wails, and he's horrified that he punched his brother. And like, what did you think would happen? And if you actually went into the analysis with the kid, you'd be like, oh, in the cartoon there was no real harm done. Like it was funny. Right. Now all of a sudden it's not funny. This person's genuinely offended, and you're like, you're an idiot. And the kid's like, I'm a kid. I'm not an idiot. And we adults just miss this. But it happens at that 2-year-old, 3-year-old, 4-year-old level with some frequency if you're watching for it. So importing that up into adulthood, there are adults, you probably know them, who are still inadequately self-aware, both of their own mental processes and what their lives have as an effect on others, that in that dawning moment of realization, sometimes it's because it happens back to them or whatever, they realize, you know what, I am the problem. The source of all my problems is me today. And that dawning realization is sometimes the beginning of the conversion of that person towards a less selfish lifestyle, towards a more loving lifestyle.
When you look at those two opposing quadrants,
These two here, yeah.
CG, yeah, you could essentially say that what I call it the injustice argument. It's not. It's an argument that says unless you have something to compare injustice to, there is no injustice.
I see. Yeah, the justice. There's some standard of justice up there.
Like, yes, if I'm in the darkness, yes. I don't know there's light until I see light because I'm continually in the darkness, and I think it's that way always. So essentially, those two quadrants, God has to reveal light to them. He has to reveal to them their choice.
I would buy that up to the
and then one makes
to
a
the
choice
point where you
that says
believe
no, and the other makes a choice that says yes.
That makes sense as long as we're entirely in darkness.
As long
as we're entirely in darkness. I think that if you're in a world, like maybe there are some people who grew up in an incredibly dark world, kids who, you hear these horror stories once in a while about some kid who was, born, they kept him basically in like a closet. They didn't even give him a name. This was a famous psychological kid. There was a book or a story about the kid with no name, or the kid called it, or the kid called baby, or something like that. So like they didn't even bother to give the guy a name. That kid may have grown up in such darkness that the second he sees anything approximating like kindness, he's baffled by it. He's like, what are you doing? This is not what I came to expect. But most people grow up with some light and some dark immediately.
So the E, you could essentially say, if you use the light and dark argument, the E is someone who has never seen light and will never see light.
I think, I see. By C, I mean observe. So the E person is someone who sees the light and hates the light and wants to extinguish it. The G is somebody who sees the light and wants to grow it and can't even conceive of why you would want darkness. And then the contingently evil people are the ones who, as long as it's all light, they're all good. The contingently good people are the ones who think they want darkness. This is I only bring this up because I saw a recent presentation on it of, and maybe this isn't still as valid, but in the question was like, why do ladies like the bad guy? Like in the old '60s things, it was like, why'd they like the guy in, the leather biker, bad looking dude, right? Yeah, sorry, I'm a little too close to your era, right? And the presentation at the time was basically suggesting that what the ladies wanted out of men in general was strength, and particularly strength that was willing to protect them. And maybe it didn't say it this way, but arguably at the expense of somebody else. In short, if somebody attacks your home, this guy's lethal enough to stop the threat. That kind of idea. So that was at least the hypothesis of what was being driven at that time. So let's say something like that is let's pretend that's true for a second. Then it's easy for the lady in this case, or the guy if there's some inverse of it or a different version of it, to say like, well, what I want, I'm looking for this kind of thing. And you don't ask yourself the question of, well, the kind of person that I want to be able to protect me needs, yes, demonstrated capability to protect me, but also it needs to be only univalent. It cannot also turn back and harm me, which is, of course, what happens a lot of times with the quote-unquote bad guys. Yeah, he's capable of protecting you. He's also capable of beating you. So you got to get a guy who's so good, he can't even conceive of beating you, but yet he's ideally not immediately lethal to everybody else, right? Somebody comes up and threatens your house, and he's not like just headshot. That one's down. Like presumably, there's some spectrum of violence that can stop that earlier.
All I was saying is just if you view that model, that paradigm, from a point of view of the revelation of light, the top one it was born in light.
Yep.
The bottom was born in darkness and will never see light.
So I object.
And the two opposites will see light.
I don't want to say that. I object to your framing. And the reason I object to your framing is born in darkness and born in light, being deterministic of what the person is, suggests very heavily that if God were to put this person, that God had this person born in darkness and therefore they're evil. I don't think that's the case. Like, in fact, the most evil.
Because we were created in the image of God, everybody has that little piece of God's image in them. And even the E will have that little bit of light in them.
Consider the devil. Consider the most evil person we know of, right? The most evil person we know of was certainly not conceived in darkness. They were entirely in light, in heaven, in the presence of God himself. And it was a complete rejection of the light that causes the darkness.
Yeah, that's a good argument. And it's biblically sound.
Yeah, right. But it has the advantage of being biblically sound, right? I would love for my arguments to also be biblically sound. Yeah, right.
Quick aside.
Yes.
I've always liked this argument. I view it as kind of a unique or novel approach to this problem, and I think it is worth finding, 1 or 2 minutes to explain it. Are you going to address the problem from any other perspectives? Namely, there's a lot of other ways that theologians of all stripes have had to deal with the problem of evil. Playing faith as is logical and probabilistic arguments for it. But also, I think a really big issue for me that hits me the hardest is the fact that God does not abandon us in our suffering. He himself entered into his creation and suffered and died.
Yeah.
To be reconciled with us, and that's huge. Atheism cannot give you that. Atheism says that at the end of the day, it's what did Dawkins say? Blind, pitiless indifference.
Yes.
That's the answer that atheism has the person who has experienced real trauma, as opposed to Christianity, which, when you take a really traumatic event, Christianity can come in and say, look, there's a God that loves you so much. He's willing to do all these things for you. He's willing to, bear any cross to be reconciled with you and to bring you into not just, a relationship with him, but also a restoration of all things.
This argument, to me, is compelling to you because you are redeemed. Those of us who have seen and tasted and felt the grace, the delta between the depth of our depravity and the height of his holiness, and the instant wish of the father of the prodigal, all that together makes us be like, oh, The unredeemed don't see that the way that you do. And so I think that it's very compelling. Like if you spoke that, you would watch the audience and all the Christians would be nodding. And the atheists would cross their arms. I don't think it compels them, or the skeptics might cross their arms.
To them, it's foolishness.
Well, to them, it doesn't make sense because they haven't experienced it. So, like, imagine describing love to someone who's never felt it. Right? It looks like somebody's on drugs, for all you can tell, right? So, so Craig does the logical problem of evil and the emotional problem of evil, and what he says is, we shouldn't even be talking about a logical problem of evil because no philosopher today even believes that the logical problem of evil still exists. But the opponent here also believes that. He already says in his written work and has said in some of the stuff he's talking about, he goes, yeah, it's possible that God has a reason for all of this stuff. He goes, so he admits this one, but he says, but it's highly improbable because, and then he starts talking about horrendous suffering. Craig, who only cares about the logical, is like, since it's logically possible, you have no right to say it. Obviously, this argument's over. And sometimes I want to be like, Bill, not everybody sees this quite as robotically as you do, man. This right here is a big problem. And he doesn't punt. He is way too brief in his answer. His answer is, there could be very good explanations of why God would want to do this, but he doesn't go into any explanation. So I think that the weight of the emotional problem of evil, that does seem to be really, really compelling to a lot of people, is what we have to talk about. And so what I'm trying to do is say, like, okay, if this is a probable, not probable, and probable, and this is a spectrum of, from 0 to 1, and so we're trying to fix some probability here. The standard is, basically, are we bigger than 0.5? What's more probable that we would see the world that we currently see? Is it down here, which is what the atheist response is? Like, no. It's very improbable we would see a world with this much horrendous. The Holocaust does not occur in a world with a God that is loving to his people. I'm trying to not even say, like, oh, let's bump this up to maybe 0.5. I'm trying to say you're practically at unity on this. Like this to me, the design argument should be compelling, like incredibly compelling to anybody who believes in scientific evidence. And the reason for that being, when you run the probabilities, we typically say something like, the probability that this happened by random chance is 1 in 10 to the 10 to the 120th power, or something like that. Let's say if you're talking the entropic type of stuff, initial conditions type of thing. And you're like, oh yeah, okay, that's the problem that happened by. That's the wrong way to phrase it. The right way to phrase it is, the probability that this happened by design. Because first you have to say, what's the difference between chance and random chance and not random chance? So not random chance is agent intent, right? That's simply what not chance means. So it's not that it's this, it's that when you run the inversion of this one, it's 10 to the 10 to the 120th over 10 to the 10 to the 120th. The reason that we put those two together is this number up here is like, this basically minus 0.0000 ... by the time you go out 120 spaces, 1. Like that's the ratio, which for all intents and purposes is 1. In this universe, this number would be approximated to 1, 100 orders of magnitude before this, right? 100 zeros before this, we wouldn't even get there. So what the scientific evidence is, just by going out and looking at a tree, just by going out and looking through the telescope at what you can see without even going deep field on everything, the probability that this universe was created is more close to certain than literally any other scientific truth that we know. Like, we shouldn't even be debating this. This is stupid obvious that this universe was designed by an intelligence. And that fact right there is never adequately called out as far as I'm concerned. They always talk about it this way and be like, well, it can't be random chance. And like, you guys are missing the point. It is obviously designed. And this is one factor. There are dozens. There's 20 plus of these kinds of things. Greater than 20 plus, that's a little redundant. So in the same way, I want to go to the emotional problem and say, not like there could be. Like, this is the way it has. If you think about it, if you spend an hour thinking about this, you will come to the conclusion of there's no better way to get everybody to get the maximum number of people to love you than letting them have their freedom and letting them work that out themselves. It's simply down to a question of where can you limit. Lewis answered, or made an attempt at answering this question of saying, like, do you stop the person right when they hit the other individual? Do you stop them mid-swing? Do you stop them before they think about moving their arm? Where do you stop the evil from happening? And part of the problem is, and this is the point that I want to develop a little bit between now and then, is consider atrocious things like the Holocaust. So you might say, why do you have to have Holocaust level horrendous suffering? And I would say it's this way, and this is tough to explain. I think this is a sticky moral issue, I think, for a lot of people emotionally. But right now, if you say, what's one of the most evil things you can think of, many people will go to like Nazis and the Holocaust, right? If you transport us, the problem is we don't think this way because we haven't been taught our own history. But if you transport us, Americans, back to the 1920s and the 30s, and you say what was going on in America at the time, it was eugenics. It was taking some of the thoughts of like, hey, these are some of the things that we're learning about genetics, and these are their lessons. And we had built designs for mobile gas chambers. That were basically Monty Python-esque, bring out your dead kind of thing. I'm not dead yet, you'll be stone cold in a minute. It was pull it out and a place to get rid of with stuff like Zyklon B. People who were old and infirm and undesirable and all that other kind of stuff. And how many people you got rid of was what was under debate, not how would you do it, and is it a good idea to some people. We had involuntarily sterilized 20,000 people in California, mostly criminal sex offenders, that kind of thing, but involuntarily, right? And so this stuff was heading in this direction, and it's hard to say because who wants to do the experiment? But the argument might be something like this: the moral rejection of this line of thinking, it only ever comes when you see the extreme end of what happens. So it takes a Holocaust for people to turn around and be like, we're not going to do anymore. We're not going to do that. Genocide is a word that came out of the Holocaust, and now we use that as like a moral imperative. Like, this smells like genocide. We're not even getting anywhere close to that. A lot of people are like, that's not genocide. Be like, but the fact that it even smells like it makes it morally abhorrent to people. So there's on the individual level, you may not need to see that, but on the national level, on the big idea level, people may have to see that level of evil before they reject it as a nation. So there's an argument that it's, if not necessary evil, it's useful evil in that people have now rejected anti-Semitism. Like anti-Semitism prior to the Holocaust, if you don't know it, anti-Semitism is still like institutionally rampant in some places. In, I think it was the country of Georgia. I don't want to accuse Georgia if that wasn't right. One of the old Soviet era, now liberated republics, had introduced a measure, not they didn't adopt it, but it introduced a measure to basically kick all the Jews out of their country. Again, in this century. And you're like, what? That was way more prevalent behind. Read Martin Luther's instruction about what to do with the Jews. It's a lot of it. It wasn't put them in concentration camps and kill them, but it was basically everything up until then. It was like, don't let them walk down the street, kick them out of your country, possibly. Like you read it and you're like, good gracious, who's this guy? But culturally, there was a heck of a lot of anti-Semitism running around. Now, anything that smells like anti-Semitism, there's a huge fight, welling up against it. Now, not huge enough, but not huge. If it's the case that you watch something as horrific as a Holocaust, and it's still not enough to dissuade some people, then there's an argument for like, well, that level of evil, what was not only necessary, it turns out that was insufficient to still convince everybody who was looking at it that that's the kind of evil. So you still got Holocaust deniers who were like, yeah, that would be evil, but it never happened. And then you got people who are like, yeah, well, whatever, we still want to kick Jews out of our country. So even that wasn't enough. And that would be my counter argument to like, why does this horrific stuff have to happen? I'll be like, it is horrific, and it still wasn't enough to stop the world from not doing this anymore. There's so many hands. You guys fight amongst yourselves. I'll feel like
was the contention good? Is that they have to be exposed to evil outside themselves?
Contingently good, yes, that's, well, had to be exposed to evil. Yeah, I think that's right.
Because
I don't know that I'm willing to say evil outside themselves. They have to at least be given the opportunity to do or observe evil.
So what would they do in an alternate world?
If you put it in my mind, if you dropped me, I'll use me as the example. I would use you as well, because I think that everybody in this room is probably the contingently good. Maybe I'm wrong about that. If you dropped me in heaven, the problem is I'm the kind of guy who would at some point basically, I don't think I would drop rocks off an overpass. I'm not that kind of guy, but I am the kind of guy who looks at an order and is like, this is the way things are going, but does it have to be this way? Like, I see that everybody's following this implied rule. Is that written down anywhere? Do I have to do that? And so the answer is like, well, what if I can't see myself doing something like, I need to think about this more, about the kind of thing I would do in heaven that's not right. But people have, give me 60 seconds, be patient with me, because I want to run around this quick circle to bring back to this point. I think that we often are afraid as believers, and I've heard theologians say, when you get to heaven, you lose your free will, basically. Like, you can't do wrong. I don't think that's right. I don't think that's the case, but I think that what happens is the contingently good in heaven get to the point where, you imagine something like this. There's these contingently evil people. You're next to them in heaven. They're one of them's your neighbor. You're sitting next to them, and you guys are walking around like mowing your lawn. I don't know what you do here in heaven. Like, presumably you don't mow your lawn in heaven. You're doing whatever you want to do. Let's say you're doing research in heaven, and it's neat, and you're changing genomes and stuff. And the person and you are talking. The person says something like, "Well, what would happen if we made this particular change? What if we did this thing?" And you said to them, we did do that. And I'm not going to tell you what happened, but it ended very badly. So you, knowing what happens on the evil side, would say, I'm not doing that because I know how bad it is. And the other person, presumably if they're that good, would be like, oh, okay, yeah, God put you here because you're the guys who messed it up, and you're telling them, well, I'm not curious about what happened. I just know that's bad stuff, this is good stuff. So it's an overly simplistic model that misses a few things. But I think that it's the case that the reason that we who have experienced enough evil and it's not just once, it's like I've seen a lot of the ways evil can work out, and I know we should not do that, that when the temptation comes, so to speak, we will reject it because we know the evil that it brings. We have one advantage that we don't have, and it's the same one last time. You remember I talked about telling the youth, hey boys, you don't believe in God. If you did, you would never look at pornography. The argument was, if Dad was standing there, I wouldn't look at pornography, but Dad wasn't standing there, I might or I would. God is standing there, so to speak, the whole time in heaven. So you always have God's immediacy version of it. So the only people who are going to be evil in heaven are the people who look God in the face and is like, yeah, no, I got it that you want to do it this way and that you're perfect and good and all that stuff. I'm doing it the other way. That's the level of rebellious you'd have to be in heaven, which is why you can just get rid of only the people who are shake your fist at God bad. You can toss all those guys, and nearly everybody else experientially will have learned that that's not the thing to do. And so you can maintain perfection in heaven because of the immediacy of God's presence and the knowledge that people have of what the evil would in fact bring.
That's like what Satan did, like he rebelled against God and
kicked him right out, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you can do Satan level of like, yeah, I see you. I don't care. I want to be in charge. Are you sure about that? 100%. All right, out. 1 in 3 angels is like, seems legit. Let's give it a shot. You guys are out there. I'm sure that was an all too brief summary of the War of Heaven.
As a brief aside, when this problem comes up, I always want to say, who says God doesn't stop a tremendous amount of evil?
Oh, 100, absolutely. But I don't want to make that argument because it assumes that God's miraculously intervening ways that we can't evidence ourselves. I'm trying to take people from basically, okay, emotional problem of evil. I agree with you. Build your own world. How would you do it? And in my mind, the conclusion is, if our goal, and it depends on what your goal is, right? If your goal is to have a perfect world, you can do that by just putting these people in it, or just putting these people in it. Yeah. And you got it. There you go. You got heaven, no problem. But God, being able to look into the future, if this argument makes a lot more sense to people with children. So the audience is going to be insufficiently, at that point in their life, where this argument makes sense. But when you say like, hey, you can have it's totally in your power to have any of your kids, to have all of your kids. Which one would you not want? Just so that everything was better at home for a while. For how much longer? I don't know, for 5 minutes. Like you'd have no struggle in your life for 5 minutes. Stuff that you absolutely could undo at the end of the day. But which kid would you eliminate? Right. Some people have an answer to that question.
Unfortunately, someone came up in my head.
I mean, I'm not saying anything, but you know, right? No, just kidding. Yeah, if at some point, if the parent can look at the children and say, "I love this one less because they took longer to come around," that doesn't read very well for an all good God, right? An all good God says, "The problem child, I love just as much as the kid that never does anything wrong." And you're like, "I like that. That sounds good, right?" That's what we want. We may not want it immediately at the time, right? I totally feel your pain on that.
I think
I'm not going to ask who that is at this point.
What we were talking about like the last few weeks, and that as well as like the more popular idea of like, oh, our universe is a simulation, where you can say, like, if you had a kid and you had to keep them in a simulation until they were 18, like, what would the properties of that simulation be? It's like, would it be a world with like no consequences and like just like bliss forever, or would it be trying to build something in that?
I'm not sure I'm getting what you're picking up, what you're laying down. I think you're saying, could we run each individual in an individual simulation and get this out of it?
No, it's like if like you had an heir that was gonna, I guess, like take over for you, but they had to be in a simulation till they were 18. Like, how would you design that
Simulation. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. But to my mind, the obvious thing is like put them up against all the things you want them to reject. Right. So if you're God and you want people to go in heaven, and you're like, these are the 723 ways things that can go wrong. You need experts in heaven who know that things are headed down the track of the 723 ways it can go wrong, and that they'll stop it from going that way. Think of an engineer who's running a dam or something, or I don't know. They're like, look, these are the 5 different ways a dam can fail massively. So you need those engineers who are like testing and drilling and monitoring or whatever, and be like, hey, remember that whole thing about too much water saturating the land around there? All of a sudden, the whole dam and everything else slides away. That's happening right now. We need to lower the water level. So that kind of stuff is only known experientially to those people in such a way that they care about it enough. So I'll put it this way as well. This happens all the time in engineering. Engineers, people who are responsible for this stuff, ignore things they don't know are threats. Consider Chernobyl. If you don't know that the design of the RBMK reactor has a spike when you pull in this particular xenon condition, when you pull these rods out or you drop the control rods in, that it'll spike the temp or the radiation level at a particular point, you don't care. You're just like, I can scram the reactor, no problem. And that's what they do. They hit the scram button on the reactor because they didn't care, because they hadn't experienced it. Now, any remaining RBMK reactors, nobody hits the scram button before knowing whether or not they're in that condition, to the level of they're like, this is global catastrophe level mistake. So you had to have a global catastrophe before the nuclear engineers, who are not the least careful of all people, would turn around and pay adequate attention to not blowing up their reactor and killing hundreds, thousands.
I just think like, I guess the initial impulse, like for the atheist or most people, is like, oh, I just want them to be happy.
Yes.
But then we go back to like, okay, in the simulation, like using heroin with no consequence.
Yes.
They're gonna come out, and it's like, now there are situations that you would like want to prevent. So it's like, you don't want them just to be like physically in pleasure, you want them like more than that.
Yes. I think that's right. And I think the struggle is articulating that in the brief period of time. By the way, if Eric wanted to know sometime, Eric and I have discussed why this class in its current format is not something that's immediately obviously beneficial to other people. And this is the reason why. This is the picture frame that we're putting around this picture and being like, look, if you sit in solid ground, this is the kind of conclusion you can come to. And People are like, great, sign me up for the class. Okay, sorry. A little self-criticism about my own artistic and planning ability when it comes to discussion.
I think after the debate, we may have a large influx.
Well, so yes, God willing, if things go well, that would be the case.
Yeah.
Now, what do we do with that? And I think, so I think there are two things. Who suggested it? It may have been Michael that suggested this, but run up to the debate. Interest in the debate typically does this, and then there's a quick there's maybe a little drop off like that. So ideally, what you could do is right after the event, have a class where you say, like, we're going to sit around and discuss all of what just happened in there. And so I think that's a good idea. On how and in what format to do that is important. So there's an argument. God may be taking this out of my hands. Like, I might be traveling 2 days after the event for a little while, for a couple weeks at least. So if that's the case, the real question is, foot stomp, who would want to lead and discuss this one? Because there's another kind of thing that makes sense of, like, hey, after the debate, come to one of the debater's side and I'll explain to you how I was right. Right? That doesn't seem to be fair. So it might be nice to have that led by somebody else. Alternately, we could sit around and be like, these are the points that were brought up, these were not answered. Like we said in the debate, these weren't answered. One of the things I would plan to do is, like, here's argument A, B, and C. We'll look for challenge. Here are their premises. Here are what they assume. Let's see if any argument is made against this one. Come back and rebuttal, like, literally no arguments were made against this. So this, just so you know, this still stands. That kind of thing, yes. But more in-depth discussion, I think, is warranted. And so how we go about doing that is an open point. And I don't have a great idea how to do it. I would probably do it like this, and I doubt this is the best way to do it.
In this debate, is your strategy to try to refute his arguments, or to go on the offensive and make your own assertions and speak to the audience?
So unlike my opponent, who would hopefully want to keep their argument quiet, I'm more than happy to send him a note sheet of, like, this is what I'm going to argue, because I'm so confident in the truth of the arguments and the propositions that I'm like, these are not reasonably debatable.
So you're really talking to your audience, not to him.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, you never talk into your debate opponent.
Okay.
I've never once in my entire life even heard of a debate where the other debater on the stage is like, oh God, that's a good point. I didn't think about that. Hey, never mind. I cancel the rest of the debate. This is right.
Both ways, the English debate
Yes.
and the American debate.
Yes.
In the American debate, you go on the offense and you're pointing points and you're speaking to your audience. You're trying to convince your audience.
Yes.
English debate, you're trying to trip up the guy on his own arguments.
Right.
Very little facts. Americans get up and we fact.
Yeah.
Brits, they get up, I call it tap dancing. They attack the person for his own argument. And there's very little fact. They just, well, you said blah, 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 and away they go. You've been in NATO exercise. You've seen the way they perform, and that's their style of arguing and debating. And it's just a different strategy.
I'm not quite as critical of the Oxford style of debating as you are, but I would say...
Don't they have the audience exit through the different doors?
Yeah, and in some places, those for the proposition, those against it.
Harvard debates, they typically do that. You go out and they
Oh, and that's how you weigh the audience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now we have clickers, but I don't know if we've got the clickers. But
Isn't it just never shop allowed?
yeah, that's Parliament. I think you're thinking Parliament. Just kidding. If you have a so in my opinion, Bill Craig has been good about laying out, going up against the world's finest and being like, these are my 5 arguments. And by the way, in every debate, I'm going to say it so exactly the same that you could literally just turn it down and be like, I'm going to say what Bill's saying right now. And you'd be like 95% correct. So he's got 5 arguments that are, as far as I'm considered, ironclad. The part where they get, where they're less certain is, so here are the premises, here are the conclusions of all of them. All of those are ironclad, but the supporting argument for each of the premises are the places where where all the debate occurs, almost all the debate occurs. And so it's these supporting arguments each have their own premises and conclusions, of course. And it's each one of these premises that you need a sub-argument for. And so the problem, as you can see, is if you run 5 arguments like he typically does, you end up with something like, 15 to 20 supporting arguments that you have to make some key thing. So I'm probably going to pick 3, one of which is very limited in how many supporting arguments you have to have, and then 2 of which I happen to think are compelling. But then knowing that the opponent just wrote a book on the problem of horrendous suffering, and his whole raison d'etre, not raison d'etre, but his reason for debating entirely is to support his own blog and book publication and editing, is that we know what he's going to talk here about, and the other portion, that this is going to be the problem of evil and suffering. And so if, I want to meet him on his ground, because I happen to think 2 things. One, I think that this ground belongs firmly to God. And secondly, I think that we have a unique argument in here that is not, I haven't heard out in the world. I've never heard anybody else out in the world say, we're living in the best of all possible worlds, and it should be fairly obvious to most people, because when you do the exercise yourself. So Bill will spend 20 minutes on all 5 of these. I would like to spend, I think we're going to have 25-minute opening statements, so I'd like to spend 12 minutes on these, and the remaining 12 on this right here, or something like that. So almost half and half, knowing that regardless of what I say about this, he's going to be dismissive on these, because he always is. But I think we've got good ways to prevent the dismissive thing from happening, and it's basically going to be like a scorecard that I put up initially and be like, this is what he's going to say. I'm going to come back in rebuttal and be like, he said what I told you to. Please note that it doesn't affect the argument at all. And so these could basically be, 3 verified wins by the end of the debate. But this is really what the debate is about.
So you don't even think he'll address the 12?
He has, in the past, he's done such a poor job of doing that unless he magically became a genius overnight, that's a known relatively easy win. I don't have to do that much thinking about it, because he's already lost this debate so many times in public. Part of the problem, though, is people who are watching these debates don't realize when somebody gets crushed. My favorite example of this is Bill Craig versus Sam Harris, where Sam Harris, if you were grading the debate as a logician, you're like crushing, embarrassing win to Craig on this one. A lot of people left out and was like, yeah, Sam did a really good job. You're like, are you kidding me? He literally lost. Not only did he lose the debate, if you have his book, The Moral Landscape, you should just go throw it directly in the trash, because he both admitted and Bill pointed out that this isn't even possibly true. We know for a fact that logically it cannot possibly be true. That's how bad that debate went. Those you usually don't have them that one-sided, but even in so one-sided debate, most people are like, seems legit, Sam did a good job, because his oratory skills were adequate, and because he spends most of his time. If you turn around and you say, what do guys like this opponent and Sam Harris do, it's this percent logical argumentation, and it's not a lot of it, and it's this percent stone throwing. Christians are dirtbags. This God is terrible because, fill in the blank with this evil. This is what stuff that happens in Muslim societies. This is stuff that happens in Christian societies. It's awful. This is stuff, and they just sit there and they stone throw the whole time. And by the time you look at the volume of fire and you're like, oh gosh, that must have been amazing. You don't look at the opponent and be like, gosh, you didn't get hit by any of those. I wonder why that is. So people are not really good at grading debates in their head because they've practiced at this. And that's not their fault. Nobody's trained them in this. Why should we expect it? So part of the onus is on us to articulate this in such a way that everybody in the audience is like, yeah. And one of the best ways to do that to me is pictorially and be like, okay, we said A, B, and C. And we said he was going to say D, E, and F. Did he say D? He did say D. He said it here. Did he say E? He did say E. He said it here. Did he say F? Yeah, he said that right here. Now, what did we say was the problem with D, E, and F? We said it didn't work because 1, 2, 3. And you turn around and you say, so you see these arguments still go through. So if you really value logic and evidence, you'll see that all of the logic and all of the evidence are on this side, even by his own admission. So when you can do that kind of stuff, people ought to be able to walk out and be like, okay, well, he couldn't have done that well because they literally showed how this failed. This one right here, we don't have as much data on it. So the question is, how impactful to an uninitiated audience, let's say an uninitiated means you guys have thought deeply on this for a very long time. The other side.
The undecided. Undecided,
sorry, yeah, that's right. Both the opposition and the undecided. You have sat and thought through it, potentially with the predisposition to wanting to believe the theistic explanation. where's a test audience that we've run this argument on that, to my knowledge, it doesn't exist. So maybe that's something we do between now and then with an adequate sample size to say whether this was helpful or convincing. But that to me is the unknown. So the best that I can think of, absent data that help us out with that, is to do the 12-minute version of the 5-minute argument that I said of like how we should do it. I think including the study, because it shows that it's not just pulled out of philosophical thin air, but like we've tested the hypothesis, and the hypothesis breaks down to our society being 50-50 on people who would want to do the right thing and people who are like, no, I'd still eat the apple, or no, I don't want to live in heaven. There's still somebody in charge there. I want to be in charge. And that's what a 1,000-person data survey suggests.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the arguments go down to like, here are examples of religious societies, and they fall short of a hypothetical ideal atheist world. So therefore, like, don't you want to be on the team that's working towards this idealized, perfect atheist world? And to do that, we have to reject like all these religious societies.
Yeah, so that point gets brought up a lot. I call it the Star Trek phenomenon, where people are like, what's the perfect secular future look like? They're like, Star Trek, we love Star Trek. Everybody lives in harmony, we're out exploring the galaxy. The only bad guys are the Romulans. I'm like, oh, you got bad guys now. Yeah, but they're from an alien society. None of the people will be bad. I'm like, oh, good. Historically, what does your experience teach you about that one? So I think at some point, actually it was interesting in that one of the powers that we are starting to come into and will undoubtedly use in the future turned out to actually be the bad guy in the Benedict Cumberbatch version of it, where it was a genetically engineered human that was like, yeah, got it, noted. I know what to do here. We're going to kill all the people who we need to in order to make this work. So I don't know that I know, man, what the best way is to do that, other than to try to put the onus on the people who are thinking about it. And like, I don't know, let me ask by show of hands, for those of you who have heard, so who have heard an adequate version of this paper, Problem of Evil, by show of hands? My articulation of like, here's how we know we're living in the best possible world. So, okay, so I've got 5 or 6, 7, okay. Of those 7, raise your hand if you think that it's compelling when you had to think through it yourself. And nobody seems to be dying to put their hand in the air. So what was it that made it, is it compelling? Raise your hand if you think it's compelling.
You have to dwell on it.
Okay.
What made it compelling was the discussion. I don't think reading your paper.
Right.
Like what led me to read your paper, the first time I saw it in the stack, I didn't really understand it.
Well, that just means it's poorly written, right? So how do we take a poorly written paper and turn it into a well-articulated, short presentation, right? That's the question. Yeah, 12 minutes. That's the 64,000 mile. So if any of you geniuses got an idea on that one, let me know. Sorry, go ahead.
I think it encompasses like the different type of people in it. I guess cares for all the different kinds of people. I don't know. It doesn't seem as harsh as some people think it would be.
What do you mean?
So
pause like, 1 second really quickly. This week, let me try to write a non-technical, that wasn't technical, but I'll try to write a better written version of that one, and I'll send it to everybody here, and you can cut it apart. Sorry, back to what you were saying.
Yeah, a lot of people assume Christianity is viewed as very harsh.
Like, okay.
Do what you're told, otherwise you'll be smited or
Yeah.
or whatever. And it seems a lot more gracious. It's like, we're doing this to give you as much freedom as you can, and doing this because, like, you know.
Yeah, but I think that's something that, like, some Christians sort of get it right. Listen to me, I'm sitting in judgment of Christendom. It seems to me that there are people that there are 2 ends of the spectrum. And one of them is the smiting end of the spectrum, which is sinners in the hands of an angry God, kind of stuff where, not that that's not true, but like people who are like, yes, sinners in the hand of an angry God is exactly the sentiment that we ought to be telling other people. I'm like, okay, maybe a little bit too hard on that side. On the other side, though, it feels like the people who are this is all about grace and love, and God wants us to be forgiven and all that. That all of the liberal churches are over here to the point where it was like, no, God doesn't think anything's wrong. It's fine. Be who you are. I don't know. So, hands, sinners on the hands side and the it's very liberal side. So where does the truth lie? And the most relevant parable that Jesus tells that pushes it somewhere, and at least pushes it from here into this direction, is the parable of the prodigal son, where the guy's as wrong as he can possibly be, up until the point where he repents. And I think the part that some of these people forget is that there's the repentance part. It wasn't that he came back as a whoremongering, terrible steward who loves only himself. It's that he comes back and he's like, I was totally wrong. I apologize, and I'm so wrong. Not only should I stay away, I should come back and serve you. That level of repentance is sometimes missed by this side, but before the guy even said that, because his intent was clearly to come back, you have the father undignified running at the guy, right? So that portion of it means that, to me, that this is not a good way to characterize it. It's not all inclusive, but you can't miss the repentance part and be like, I'm willing to be your slave at this point. Like that, it's got to be somewhere here in the middle. And how to articulate that is the question.
It's interesting. I like to look at that example from the good son's point of view. That's what I call the anger gospel. You did wrong. You went away. You got what you deserved when you were eating pig slop.
Yeah.
Now, why are you taking him back?
And if we were going to write the modern story of it, what I don't know is when the father says to
that's not much grace,
right? But it's a reasonably I think that one of the reasons Jesus brought that up would be everybody listening to that story is many of the people listening to this story are the people who are like, what are you talking about? Like
the older son.
Yeah.
And there's 3 points of view. There's the young son's point of view, there's the father's point of view, and there's the older son's point of view.
Yeah.
And, like they say, your worldview depends on where you sit.
That's true. Sir. Oh, sorry. Countdown. And we need to break this thing down at 10:10. So 7 minutes. Oh, we already, how many, 7 minutes? Okay. Give me a hard stop at 7 minutes because we need to break this wall down. Mister, bring down this wall. Yes.
I'd say big problem is less than 1% of the church is exposed to the idea of Molinism, and 0% outside the church is exposed to it.
Yeah.
So the vast majority view is either Calvinism, where it's God just saves people and doesn't save people, and then people just go to hell. And then, or it's he rolls the dice.
This is a good way of saying it. Yeah, thank you for bringing this up. This is what I'm trying to say is I think we're in a false dichotomy where people are saying there's no.
It's an unfair deal.
Yeah, it's either this or it's that, and you're like, no. There's a path that actually has the advantages of both. This is the one that we need to be thinking about.
But no one's heard of that.
That's also something that had more a lot of people who have a problem with. It's not just the evil and suffering in the world. Some people almost have more of a problem with the idea of hell.
Okay. Yeah, and I also think hell's not well articulated either, and there's a wide range of that there. I agree with you. Yeah.
But I think that solves the problem, people's idea of the problem of evil, because their scope is people get evil, and then they get evil in the afterlife. If Christianity is also true.
Say that again.
Their view of evil includes in Christianity there's people that get an unfair deal.
Okay.
And so it's even by your own system, these people are getting a bad deal, and so that's that can't be true because that's also more evil. Bad deal and an unfair deal. So who gets the unfair deal in the harsh version? Well, it's the person that's not elect, and they're just God just doesn't save them, or it's God throws everyone into this world and doesn't stop.
God's not fair.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the one thing I will say, I think a lot of where here I am opening the can of worms at the end of class.
Concept of knowledge of counterfactuals.
Yeah, so I'm a very justice oriented person and have been since I was a little kid. Justice to me is the thing that matters. But the social justice movement, I don't think some of the aims and ideas of it are very, very good. The problem is the method of bringing it about. And to me, it's like communism. What's the point of communism? Point of communism is for everybody to have enough, and for not to be like super greedy people who have somehow, if they've stolen it all. Like, we don't want that. We want everybody to have adequate and good and whatever else. Yay, yeah, let's do that. But this also assumes something else, is that everybody's also equally deserving, equally good, works equally hard, etc. And so, the problem that communism doesn't recognize is that the problem with communism is people. And it's that if we could bring people up to where they're universally relatively good compared to each other, then communism would work beautifully. The reason capitalism works is it assumes everybody's evil and greedy. So given that it's evil and greedy, let's structure the market in such a way that it still brings everybody up as much as we can. Again, nowhere near a perfect system, but tends to be more effective at generating wealth because it recognizes the truth about the current human condition, which is we got more greed than we got grace at this point.
It's better than the alternatives.
Yeah, right. It's the lesser of two evils, as Master and Commander says. All right, last comments. I think we're probably running short on time. I cannot tell you how appreciative I am of effort that has gone to significant effort and thinking into helping prepare for this. Please do help. There's always that difficulty of going in. Like, so I moderated Loftus and Wood's debate, David Wood's debate here. That was a crushing victory for David Wood in terms of logical points. When you sat through the debate, if you're a Christian, you're like, yes, the Christian won this. If you're an atheist, you'd be like, yeah, the atheist got a bunch of good points. Like, it wasn't obvious. I think a lot of it because of how the conduct was. So I do not want this to be adversarial, where it's like me against him. I want it to be me standing there with science and with empirical evidence and reason, and being like, absolutely, logic is my best friend and scientific evidence is my best friend. We agree. We're all best friends here, right? And then at the end of it, be like, it's all about logic and evidence, and that's why I believe what I believe. That's the approach that I want to take on this one. Yeah. If you've ever seen John Lennox debate, that guy is so good at being gracious and loving and incredibly correct, right? But he's too doggone smart. And so the problem is you leave the debate and you're like, yeah, like, it was really a nice guy. And you're like, you understand his points were lethally good. You're like, no, there was an awful lot of general relativity in there. I'm not sure what he was talking about.
Maybe one of the checkbox should be like, it's like, would this happen in Star Trek? It's like, if no, then it's like, oh, then we must reject religion to build Star Trek world.
Right.
Where it's like, how many of the points will fall into that category of like, this would not happen in Star Trek, like, reject all religion to build Star Trek.
So, I'll tell you my principal difficulty, honestly, with this opponent's problem is when he goes into his just like, I'm going to say stuff mode, right. If you actually wrote him down and you were like, how many contradictions just happened in what he said? Because then he'll have, things that are kind of conclusions or depend on things. And if you listed contradictions, like, this is how frequently the contradictions occurred in his own thinking. Like, there is nothing, by the time you're done, there's almost nothing left that he hasn't contradicted somewhere else. The number of contradictions, if you wanted to say, like, this is a knockdown thing that you would have to point out, are, like, count that number of connections and how many times you'd have to list them. In something where he's running through this many points, saying them very briefly and coming to these conclusions, you'd have to sit there and be like, well, this and this don't work because of the following thing. You would be stuck for something like 5 times as long as he spoke, just to point out the contradictions of what he said. So it's hard to do that in that period of time. And so, I think the thing to do is probably, since we know he's going to say, is pick the ones that are kind of the most egregious and the ones that are the most fundamental and be like, look, I don't have time to tell you how many contradictions he just went through. It's on the order of like 15 to 20. Let me list the top 3 for you, and we can break it down later in the debate. But the one thing that we can tell you for sure is, based on these 3, these points can't possibly be correct. That's the kind of analysis that I think that we have to do to technically show that the debate was won on the grounds at the time, which is what you're supposed to do during the debate. Time. Thank you. All right, with your permission, thank you all very much. As much as you're willing to continue to do this, it's been enormously helpful to me. I can't tell you how grateful I am. Thank you very much. As much as you're willing to do it, please do continue to do so. And if it seems like I'm giving you short shrift, a email while driving, that is in no way reflective of anything other than my poor communication skills and lack of ability to manage time of sending back things to people who are actually materially helping me out. So thank you very much. With your permission, I think all the tables are where they need to be, but let's break down the wall and get them ready.